Are alien abductions real? Maybe we're on the cusp of finding out now that Congress has conducted what they maintain is just the first of many hearings on the phenomenon. Over 40% of Americans believe we have and are still being visited by an interstellar species. But that's not even close to the wildest part of the UFO or UAP experience, or whatever those crazy kids at the Pentagon are calling it these days. For example, one company called the St. Lawrence Agency in Altamont Springs, Florida, once offered alien abduction insurance. And another company who did the same thing in Britain once sold 30,000 policies. This next story details one of the most remarkable alien abduction claims in history. And it wasn't on a lonely road in the wee hours of the morning or in a remote logging site in a forest. It was from an apartment building in New York City. You might want to check yourself for implants after this one because it's extremely strange.
Linda Napolitano, a young woman in her 20s, claimed that on November 20th of 1989, she woke to find herself paralyzed in her bed on the 12th floor of her Manhattan apartment building, unable to speak to her husband lying next to her, to alert him to three humanoid figures with large heads floating inside the room. The beings, in an unfamiliar language, tell her to remain quiet, and somehow she understands this command and complies. How Linda arrived at this point, and the ensuing strangeness surrounding her case, will ignite a firestorm of debate and controversy that remains to this day in what has been called the alien abduction of the century. In April of 1989, ufologist and researcher Bud Hopkins received a letter from Linda Napolitano. In it, she told him she had been reading his book Intruders, his second one documenting the alien abduction phenomena. She revealed finding an unusual bump on her nose 13 years earlier, which, after being examined by a doctor, was deemed to be the result of some type of nasal procedure she likely had undergone as a child. However, Linda had not, to her recollection, had any surgery of that nature, which was later confirmed to her by her mother. Hopkins, having investigated these types of cases involving oddly appearing subcutaneous anomalies, decided to meet with her to determine whether she might be a victim of implant insertion. They met in his office where she shared her history with him, one that was otherwise unremarkable in many aspects. On the surface, none of what she disclosed could be traced back to any common characteristics of alien abduction. Nonetheless, she would go on to attend meetings of his abduction support group, where she heard fantastic tales of alien creatures abducting women for experimentation and the placement of foreign objects in their bodies. To this point, Linda just listened to their stories, not contributing any of her own to the proceedings. Then came the fateful night in November of 1989, when after putting her children to bed, she lied down in bed next to her husband and fell asleep. At around 3 a.m., she was awakened by the sense they were not alone. Looking around the room, she sees a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed, watching her. It appears to be a 3-foot-tall skeletal figure with dark eyes and a bulbous head intently staring at her, a being most associated with the species known to ufologists as a gray. She is unable to speak or move to wake her husband, who remains fast asleep. It's then that a thought enters her mind, in common language that tells her to simply shut up. By this point, Linda is paralyzed with fear, and attempts to scream are useless, as her mouth and eyes are covered by what she describes as a thin white sheet. As she falls back on her bed and attempts to remove the sheet, A feeling of numbness engulfs her body until she is completely incapacitated. As she lies there dormant, the sheet begins to dissipate, and she's now able to again see around the room. She focuses on a bedroom window where a brilliant blue light beams in and floods the room. Linda feels her body being lifted off the bed in a fetal position and float toward the light. There her body passes through the closed window and the metal bars affixed outside it. She is now outside her building, some 170 feet above the ground. She finds herself floating above the city of New York and able to make out the landscape clearly: buildings, passing headlights, smoke from chimneys, and the iconic Brooklyn Bridge. Accompanying her within the beam is the figure she saw in her bedroom, who has now been joined by two other similarly looking figures. As her ascent continues, she becomes aware of a huge windowless craft hovering just above them. There are multiple lights mounted on its oval-shaped configuration. A hatch opens and Linda and her captors are transported inside the UFO, which then speeds off into space. A strange sight awaits Linda once inside the craft, where she is in a white, almost antiseptic room, where there are benches similar to those she has seen in Central Park on walks with her family. The beam continues to transport her down a long hallway and through several sliding doors, until she enters a room where three beings are already there, waiting for her. She is then laid on a long table, still unable to budge a muscle, until she discovers that she can indeed move her mouth. She screams, but those screams just echo off the dome ceiling of the room. One of the beings reacts in a peculiar fashion to them, placing his hand over Linda's mouth to no avail, and her screams just get louder and more desperate. One of the beings then inserts a long gun-like tube into her left nostril and fires an object inside. Linda then loses consciousness for what seems only a few seconds, and when she finally comes to, she is now lying back in her bed next to her husband. A glance at the bedside clock informs her it is now 5 a.m. Linda, drenched in sweat, at this point accepts the idea that she has just endured nothing more than a horrible nightmare, and detailed memories of it begin to fade as she awakes in the morning. Yet the feeling of being unable to move and the appearance of the three gray alien beings lingers. Linda then decides to phone Bud Hopkins to tell him of what she had experienced the previous night in as much detail as she can. Hopkins speculates there is more to her story, so they agree to meet again in his office a few days later. Once there, Linda undergoes a controversial method called regressive hypnosis in an attempt to glean more details about her encounter. In her trance-like state, Linda recalls being transported from her bed into the night, floating some 12 stories above the ground. She recalls the blue light beam lifting her into a spaceship, and after multiple sessions, she is able to go into even more detail about her ordeal, or at least up to the point where she was laid on that long table. In February of 1991, something unusual and unexpected took place, and the Napolitano case would take an even more dramatic turn when Hopkins received a letter from two men who identified themselves only as Dan and Richard. They claimed to be law enforcement officers who were parked in their car under the FDR Drive the night of Linda's abduction. At 3 a.m., they claimed to have seen a large orange-colored glowing object with green lights hovering over her apartment. They also felt an unusual vibration coursing through their bodies. While trying to rationalize what they were seeing with their own eyes, they claimed to see a woman and three small gray figures floating in the skies over Manhattan. They watched as all were transported inside the object, which flew off at a high rate of speed. Both expressed concern about Linda and what her condition was as the reason they were seeking her out. They tell Hopkins they mean no harm to her, but intend to speak with her if at all possible. Hopkins informs Linda of their intention to do so. A few days later, Hopkins receives a phone call from Linda, telling him that she indeed was paid a visit by the officers and was very surprised by their initial reaction to seeing her. They seemed incredibly relieved she was seemingly in good health, and at one point, Dan fell to his knees and broke down in tears in front of her before even entering her apartment. Linda served them coffee and pastries, and they all compared notes of what transpired the night of November 20th. The conversation was open, friendly, and conciliatory, and they left the house wishing Linda the best going forward. Then about a week later, Bud Hopkins receives another letter from Richard, who claimed that after meeting with Linda, both the officers went through some traumatic occurrences. Richard expressed concern about the mental state of his partner, Dan, who had taken a leave of absence from the job as he experienced a high level of stress associated with the incident. Even more disturbingly, he claimed that after meeting Linda, Dan had become somewhat enamored with her, going so far as to prowl outside of her apartment, observing her every move when she ventured out of her home. Upon being made aware of Dan stalking her, Linda revealed having some concern about a white van constantly parked outside her building. The disturbing sequence of events took another bizarre turn when a third letter from Richard to Hopkins confesses that they are not really policemen, but security personnel who were escorting a key geopolitical figure on the night they claimed to have seen Linda being abducted, and that this client had witnessed the event as well. This revelation convinces Hopkins that this is far from anything resembling the typical abduction cases he has handled, and this intensifies when more people, 24 in total, contact him to report what they saw that night, which included the sighting of the craft, bright lights, and beings floating in the sky over New York. 2 months after her meeting with the fake police officers, Linda is walking down a street when a car pulls up beside her. Its occupants are Richard and Dan. They appear friendly, but when they ask her to get into the car, she refuses to do so. Richard then forces Linda into the back seat, where for the next 3 hours they take turns interrogating her about the encounter, what she saw, what was done to her, and what was said to her, going so far as to ask her to remove her shoes so they could determine whether she was an alien herself. Linda is now convinced the men are not who they claim to be, and when she is released, she rushes to Hopkins' office to tell him of what had just transpired. But this would not be the last time Linda encountered these men. 6 months later, in October of 1991, a red Jaguar driven by Dan pulls up to Linda on the street, and once again Richard forces her into the back seat, where another interrogation of her begins. Linda has a tape recorder on her, but Richard spots it and takes it to prevent her from recording their conversation. She is taken to a beach house on Long Island and asked to put on a white nightgown similar to the one she wore the night of her abduction. Obviously, Linda refuses. She went on to claim that Dan was demanding they have sex, which Linda rejected, but then Dan kneeled in front of her and addressed her as Lady of the Sand multiple times. When the two are otherwise occupied, Linda bolts from the house, running along the sandy beach desperately seeking help. Dan pursues her and eventually catches up to her and pins her arms. He then drags her to the water, where he holds her head underwater until a mysterious force hits him, knocking him several feet from his terrified prey. Again, Linda attempts to escape, but is again caught by Richard, who promises to keep Dan away from her if she quietly returns to the house. Upon their return, Richard holds true to his promise of keeping Dan in check, while Linda takes the opportunity to rifle through some documents they're in possession of. She comes across one with a Central Intelligence Agency header. After more questioning, she is returned to the same place where they had taken her. There is one more chance encounter with Richard a month later, as he is walking out of a bank. He informs her he is no longer partnering with Dan, as his mental state has deteriorated to the point that he's been institutionalized. That seemed to put an end to things involving Dan, until she receives a 3-page letter from him around Christmas. In that letter, he confesses his love for her, as well as the idea of considering kidnapping her to keep her with him forever. After this disturbing admission, she will not hear from Dan again. For his part, Hopkins has been kept apprised of the goings-on and begins to dig deeper into the identity of these men. He turns his focus to the license plate number of the Jaguar they were driving and discovers the model is issued to certain government agencies, but after that the trail goes cold. Now concerned for her and her family's safety, Linda experiences mounting paranoia, telling Hopkins she believes men in black suits and driving black government vehicles are constantly surveilling her. But the identity of the individual behind the curtains would reveal itself when Hopkins gets a letter from the third individual in the agent's car who observed Linda's abduction. The writer goes on to detail an impending ecological calamity the planet is hurtling towards that is concerning to certain high-ranking individuals. He also writes of alien involvement in ending the current Cold War of the late 80s and early 90s. Hopkins is then directed to stop his inquest into the abduction phenomenon, lest he destabilize the foundations of life on Earth. Because of the proximity of the United Nations to the Napolitano's apartment building, Hopkins becomes convinced the author of the letter is none other than UN Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar. The plot of this story gets even more clouded when further regression hypnosis administered to Linda has her recalling a nameless third man on the beach with Richard and Dan. She comes to believe she has been used by the alien visitors as an instrument to draw the attention of this man. Eventually, Linda would undergo a scan to her head in an effort to determine whether or not a foreign body had been placed there at the point of her abduction. A few days later, when the results are in, the doctor greets Linda, hands her the x-ray, and abruptly leaves the room. Linda brings the pictures to Hopkins, who contacts a neurologist acquaintance of his to read them. He discloses that an object of some variety is clearly in view in her nasal area. He determines the object has been surgically implanted. The object is described as 6 millimeters long, with a wire configuration at each end. But before the object can be removed and analyzed, it simply disappears from her nose, and no further examination of it can be performed. With the passing of time, Linda returned to her normal life without any additional contact with government agents or alien civilizations. Hopkins would go on to write a book about the Napolitano incident titled Witness.
Now, the Napolitano event is still considered one of the most mysterious and intriguing cases in UFO history, though it has its detractors who insist that it's nothing more than an elaborate hoax. And it does have all the conspiratorial elements one could expect in a story of this type: government cover-ups, an alien agenda, and enough twists and turns to rival a spy novel. And if you haven't heard enough, one of the agents, Richard, told Bud Hopkins for his book Witnesses that he and Linda had been abductees since childhood and had in fact formed a romantic relationship over time while inside the alien spacecraft. It's just in case you wanted to know that. So this is either a case of alien abduction or a well-contrived fraud. There seems to be no middle ground. Bud Hopkins passed away in 2011 after being maybe the greatest proponent and supporter of the alien abduction phenomena in history. And Linda, for her part, doesn't do interviews and has all but disappeared from public view. No polygraph tests, no trace evidence. Just a remarkable story that can't be proven or disproven. But if all of this is true, then it lives up to its title as the alien abduction of the century.